Hello, everyone. This is Chris Adams. Thank you for joining us for this third and final version of Balancing Act Quick Start for NGOs. Thanks also for all your feedback on what you find to be most interesting. And due to that, we are actually going to have I think a little bit more varied agenda than in the past. We're going to have two presenters right off the bat to help us, sort of understand the possibilities of using a budget simulation both for public engagement and education purposes, but also for research purposes. So we're really excited about today's agenda. The plan for today is a pretty simple one. In just a moment, if anybody has any questions or comments, just general check-in, please go ahead and let me know. Just raise a hand on your GoToWebinar control panel. And then after that, the first order of business is going to be to hear from Ryan Hankins, who is the Executive Director of the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama. And they have been using Balancing Act for nearly a year now and done a really nice job with it. And so Ryan's going to kind of walk you through what they've done, similar to what we did with Colorado. And then we've got John Daytona, who is calling in from England, who's going to talk about using Balancing Act in research context, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. And then the last sort of feature on Balancing Act that I wanted to share with you is called Meeting Mode, which allows you to use Balancing Act in a face-to-face context. And I've got some really nice photos of that, and then some good feedback from the city of Kansas City that's been using it last week and this week. And then for those of you who are interested, I've just got a couple slides on timing for budget engagement that might be a little bit more applicable to public entities, but I think might have some interest as well for NGOs. And then I'll just share some ideas on how to publicize this. So that's the plan. If you have any questions or comments, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm just going to go to the first speaker, who is Ryan Hankins from the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama. So Ryan, are you on?
I am. I just saw my face on your screen too.
Yep, your face is on the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and give you control of the webinar, Ryan, and you can just sort of walk us through what you've done in Alabama using Balancing Act, and maybe start just a little bit by telling us why you wanted to have a budget simulation in Alabama.
Sure. Do I have control now?
You do, and I think we're seeing your screen.
You're seeing my screen, all right.
Are you seeing my screen? I just got a thing that said show my screen, so maybe you're seeing my screen.
Oh, hold on. We are. Let me. Okay, let's try something slightly different here.
I don't even know my screen, so.
There we are. Now we're seeing Ryan's.
All right. Okay. Now you should be seeing a list of budgets.
Yep.
All right. Yes, well, thank you. Hello, everybody. PARCA is a statewide organization founded in 1988 and by a former governor, and his goal was that PARCA would be really the provider of objective data and policy research to the state. And from the very beginning, budget work was a central part of what we did. So I've only been here 2 years, but for our the 30 years of our history, we've done budget analysis in various forms and fashions. And in recent years, I've made extensive use of Tableau visualization software, and I can show you some of that in a second. Trying to help our citizens as well as our legislators understand the way our budget works or does not work, as the case may be. And Alabama has one of the more obtuse budget processes. We have I think we're one of two states, and Tom is on the phone, he can correct me, one of two states that have two separate budgets, an education trust fund budget, which funds education and other miscellaneous things. And then everything else is funded through a general fund. And most of our tax revenues are earmarked, so there's not a lot of play that policymakers have with the budgets. And that's not understood by anybody, even those really in the legislature. So I saw this as a natural fit to complement our past work in budgets, to educate our users and as to the complexities of the system, to the trade-offs that are required, and also to really collect data. We do at least 1 or 2 budget research pieces a year, looking at the newly adopted budget in the spring, and then looking at year-end closeouts in the fall. So our desire is to really launch this tool publicly for the general public this fall. And let me just show you that quickly. Launch this tool in the fall now with a mock-up of the 2019 budget. And this is kind of what that looks like right now. It's a little bit messy. We're still playing around with some things. We don't have a surplus. That's an error on my issue. But we will start with the adopted FY18 budget and then build in some expenses that we know we will have. We know that beginning in 2018, the state will pick up an annual debt payment of $114 million for past infrastructure improvements, in addition to the $206 million debt payment. We balanced the FY18 budget was balanced by taking about $100 million in settlement money from BP from the 2012 oil spill, and that's how we were able to fund Medicaid at the federally required levels last year, was by moving that money from the BP settlement into our general fund. That won't be there in FY19. So we'll start with the FY18 budget and then build in some of those new expenses we have to incur. So when this goes live for real, you should see probably a $250 million deficit instead of a $579 million surplus when we start. Other than that, I think we've structured things fairly similarly to the way others have. I'll show you education right here. It's not all fleshed out, but you'll see we've built in some of the questions similar to Colorado. How should we fund our education system on a per student basis? A note here that if we increase our funding on education, we've got to fund that through sales tax or income tax. So we'll have a matching notice on the revenue side. So I put in national average and then states that we often compare ourselves to, and see how that would change the numbers. The one thing that we have done that may be more different than others is looking at the revenue models. So we've built out the revenues from the taxes that people tend to care about, really. And I'll show you property taxes. Rather than inviting people to adjust revenues on a percentage or dollar amount, we're looking at a model that looks at yields. So what this is we generated $389 million in property taxes last fiscal year. So the question would be, do we leave that flat, or do we seek to generate property taxes at the same per capita rate as surrounding states? So we'll have done the back end numbers here, and people will say, oh, we want to tax ourselves at the rate of Mississippi because we like lower taxes. But what should happen is it would be almost $2 billion increase if Alabama had property taxes similar to Mississippi. So the numbers here aren't quite right, but I wanted you see how we're doing that concept. So we think that communicates more than asking someone to raise a tax by a few percentage points or cut it by a few percentage points. So looking at how our revenues might compare to surrounding states and how that would impact our overall budget. Let me quickly show you something completely different, though. This is a way that we have used this on another project. We were asked by the City of Gulf Shores to look at some funding scenarios for their plan to start their own school system. And we thought this was an ideal way to use the Balancing Act tool. So we took the scenarios that they had given us and built out 4 different models. The city is looking at school systems that would have 4 different enrollment models, and you'll see those here. So we went through and built out 4 completely different budget models based on the ADM that they chose, and I will show you this one. No, I will show you this one. it's more fun. So we built a budget model out that was based beginning on their current level of funding at the school. And then we put in additional information. If you want to fund a new Gulf Shores Elementary School at the current level, then there's no change, obviously. But if you're going to go to the trouble of making a new school system, you might want to improve its performance. And if you make an assumption that that has some correlation to funding, we wanted to build that in. So I won't bore you with the process, but we generated per student numbers for what we called high-performing schools and top-performing schools. So we want to fund an elementary school at a top-performing level. Well, that would cost $1.3 million more at the elementary level. And do that for instructional support. We follow that same process here for middle school. We want the top-performing middle school and the top-performing high school, and all of a sudden you're at a $1.5 million deficit with your school system. Then we built out the different options they have according to our state law and the ordinances they have in the city of how they can fund that particular a school system. So we built out 4 models that look basically like this, with the only variances being the different enrollment projections. And you notice that none of these are published, because we built this and delivered this to the city council and mayor. And they and others have used this tool in their conversations and deliberations to decide which scenario to go, which ADM scenario to go here. And then once that was decided, how to actually fund that system, what mix of revenues did they want to do to fund the system at the level of their choosing. I think ultimately Gulf Shores has now decided to form their own school system. And then I think we will make some modifications to one of these budgets and then publish that for community input for the exact sort of revenue mix. We also may go back in and change some of these questions, less about matching high-performing and top-performing schools, and may weave in questions around class size and things that are a little bit more concrete for the general public. And I'll stop talking now, Chris, unless you have a particular question.
Boy, I think this is great. You've actually touched upon 2 things I find to be really interesting. And once again, if anybody wants to chat, wants to ask a question of Ryan, please raise your hand, including you, John, because I know that another area of expertise that you have is taxation. So if you have any questions or comments on this, more than welcome. But I'm struck by the level of detail that you have in the one for Gulf Shores, and the way that I think you've really nicely presented it in a way that it kind of presents the trade-offs for residents. We've got a couple other school districts that are using Balancing Act, but just to be candid, in some ways it doesn't seem like they're really seeking input on meaningful questions. It almost seems as though they're just sort of presenting the budget in an interactive format as opposed to sort of presenting meaningful choices. And I think you've done a great job in sort of framing up some options and showing what the cost consequences would be, so that residents can really wrestle with this choice. I think it looks great, Ryan.
Well, thank you.
What kind of feedback have you gotten from the folks in Gulf Shores?
They've been pleased. Of course, once they begin to see, how you can, well, let's add this and let's change this and let's tweak that, and it can be kind of a never-ending process. But they were happy to see all of that. What they responded with was, I can give you a customizable tool that can show you real-world trade-offs, or I can write you a 55-page report. And I really hope they went for the other, because it was far easier for us, but I also think easier for them to be able to get in. And they did not use meeting mode because these were not published, but they got in an office and threw it up on a PowerPoint and began to manipulate and build consensus amongst that group. And then that was a recommendation. From that data, they made a recommendation to the city council of how to move forward.
That's great. And then just quickly, what do you think that the presentation will be to the public? You said that some version of this will be shared with the public for their input. What are the plans for that?
I presume they will do that, because once we were finished, I gave the keys to this to the city and actually changed the passwords, and I've logged in myself right now. But I think what they want to do is pick one. I forget which scenario that they want to move ahead with, but I think they have chosen one. We will clean that up a little bit. We may add some additional, more concrete choices. And then I think they will use that really, frankly, they may use that more in the way that the other school systems that you referenced to use it, to really educate the public on what this will look like. And they believe, this is an aside, but the city believes they can fund the difference in the new school system with an appropriation out of existing revenues. They don't anticipate needing additional tax revenues in the near future. So I think they will use this tool to make that argument, try to make that clear to the citizens that this will be funded through existing city funds rather than additional property taxes.
All right. Wow.
I wanted to say, if I can, one more word about ours. The one we're doing for Alabama. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask you to return to that, because there's some really good stuff there, too.
I wanted to say why we're going down this path of property taxes. I said, or the tax revenues, this matching yields, basically. That's really what we're doing, is matching our per capita yields on these various revenue streams. We think that communicates a little easier. We think it's this may not be true in other states, but I think when our users, see that Mississippi is generating more tax revenue per capita than Alabama is, I think that will be an eye-opening realization. But also, as I mentioned earlier, a ridiculous percent of our revenue is earmarked, and if you want to, you can increase education all you want to, but you have to increase sales tax, or I'm sorry, individual income tax to offset that. And a model I built out previously really had information on the earmarked revenues and the adjustable revenues, and it was too complicated, and I thought the impact was lost. So I felt like this simplification really avoided the issues of earmarking and what taxes were correlated to what expenditure were, and got the message across that our tax revenues are low, and to sustain our current level of funding, much less meet the debt that we have coming down the road, we have to make adjustments somewhere. Barring a disaster.
Great.
And I don't know who's on the phone. I don't want to offend anybody, but we often joke in Alabama that we fund our budgets by crises, an oil spill, a hurricane, something, and we take that money and reappropriate it to cover our basic expenses.
Wow. This looks great. And so you plan on launching, you said this later in the fall?
Yes, we will. The legislature is beginning their budget work now, so we are working on a text piece, a research piece that will look at how the FY17 finals came out, final numbers, and then lay out some of the challenges that the legislature will face in the upcoming session, which will begin early January. And we will want to launch this in conjunction with that, and really let it run and do some promotional work similar to our counterparts in North Carolina. Promote that throughout the fall and through the session, which should end in spring. And then what we'd like to do is do a comparison piece. So when the new budget is adopted next spring, next May, look at this is what the state adopted. How does it compare to all the data we collected through the Balancing Act tool over the previous 6 months? So sort of this is what citizens think the budget should be, and this is how it varies to what the state actually adopted.
Wow, that's great. And we're continuing to add data and reporting features that would be useful. So let's stay in touch on that. And since you're already familiar with Tableau, it sounds like that you are. I've got a new data file that I can make available to you. That I'll talk to you offline about it, but it'd be kind of fun to share that with you and see what you might do with it in terms of visualizations.
That would be great. We would be happy to see that. And
well, good.
if I see if I have no, my other file has closed, so I won't bore you with that.
Okay.
Well, thank you. We're glad
so,
to have you on the call. We're happy to share this with everybody.
Yeah. Who's
Chris?
who's talking?
This is John.
Oh, John. Yes, of course.
Chris? Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So is this on the revenue side? This is kind of the new capability you've added. Because when we were doing this, we didn't have this. We weren't able to give them these kind of on the revenue side. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think I'll answer that one, John. I think to everyone else, John, you're breaking up a little bit. I think the connection from England is a little bit weak. But I think I heard you say that.
No, I think my internet connection here is. Yeah, my internet connection is terrible here.
Yeah, but that feature that Ryan is using, we implemented that in about July, so it came about 6 weeks too late for you guys. But this is now this multiple choice or these scenario questions. This is now available, and we've got 4 or 5 entities that are already using it, and about 10 or 12 that are looking at using it in the next 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah, it looks nice.
Yeah, I think it's a major advance. It's one that we've kind of been, building the capacity on the database side to do for a while, and you guys kind of just missed it, and I apologize for that. But going forward, it is available.
No, I think for our purposes, I mean, for the, and I guess I can get into this when I talk about the research purposes, the tax rate, having the tax rate would be great. But these are also are, especially for educational purposes of civic engagement, these kind of choices are really nice. They could give the public some really good kind of perception of of the trade-offs that are going on.
Yeah, and Ryan, I'll just reiterate that. There's some large cities that are using Balancing Act right now, and they're using this feature, the scenario question feature, in a way that I don't think it's just not very engaging or relatable to residents. But I think the way that you've done it is actually it's a meaningful question that a resident who pays attention and wants to provide some input could actually feel like it's a relevant question. So I think you've done a great job.
Great. Well, glad to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah. And let me. I'm going to just pull this back real quick. And there's Ryan's picture, and then we'll just move over here. This is John, and I think as I alluded to or said earlier, John is actually in the United Kingdom right now. He is doing a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Exeter Business School. And he and 2 colleagues at the European University Institute in Florence
Welcome to Stanford University.
They've completed the research phase, and now they're writing up an article, and it's a really fascinating some really fascinating work that they've done. They reported on in a Washington Post article about 3 weeks ago. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you now, because last time we brought this group together, they were really clear that they wanted to learn about what you all were doing in terms of adapting Balancing Act for research purposes. I'm going to send the presenter control over to you.
Yeah. So kind of the preview of what our balancing looked like. And we kind of used the if they're familiar with the bipartisan policy centers, we kind of used their model as a skeleton to ours. So our tool ended up being really quite similar to theirs. So what first got us into this is that we were working on a project called Willing to Pay. And what really interests us is how do we get revenue tax administrations to increase their revenues, to get people to be more voluntarily tax compliant. And so we did these compliance experiments for 3 or 4 years in 5 different countries with 1,500 people. and then we had some time left over, and we weren't doing many more of these experiments. So we got to thinking about. We looked a lot at the tax side, but we weren't looking so much at the spending side. And we started looking at the literature, and we were a bit not necessarily disappointed because there's a lot of good work out there in the literature on taxes and spending, but they don't really they either look at taxes or spending. So and so they don't give participants or respondents to their surveys the option to look at the budget. And we found this to be kind of problematic because in any sort of budget scenario, you have to consider both sides of the budget. And then the other thing is that traditional surveys are really great for getting at kind of single item issues. So they're really great for asking somebody how they feel about taxes on the wealthy, how they feel about healthcare spending or education spending, but they don't give people real trade-offs. So if you ask people how they feel about education, they could say, oh yeah, you should increase education spending, but then they don't see what that effect of education spending on the actual budget. And maybe reference towards taxes as well. So maybe if they are getting increased education spending, they might have to raise taxes as well. So that's kind of how we came to the budget, the Balancing Act. Is we found this tool online and we said, wow, this would really be great to give participants kind of real world trade-offs so they could see the effects of raising or cutting spending or raising taxes. So initially what we wanted to do was give them kind of full mobility on the model, to have them be able to raise taxes or cut taxes, spending or cut spending in certain areas. But as you can see, for research purposes, we had to go with a much more simplified version of the model. So if I click on income taxes, we don't allow them to decrease taxes. So we really kind of framed their choices. We framed them to say most people agreed that most people think is important, although there's not really academic consensus on that, but most people do think. So we framed their choices so that they would have to balance the budget, but they would have to either keep it the same or decrease the size of the deficit. And that was mainly for methodological purposes. So it simplified the budget and made their choices easier. It won't take them so long as well. So they could raise taxes, or then they go in and cut spending. But they wouldn't be able to increase spending or decrease taxes. So then we started thinking about, okay, so now we have this really great budget tool. We thought about thinking about it from the civic engagement side. So what if we ask people what they felt about the budget beforehand? So we would run some sort of survey in Qualtrics. I don't know if you're familiar with Qualtrics, but it's just a tool that you can use to make surveys and put them online. It has a lot of interesting, really nice capabilities. So we asked them beforehand how they felt about taxes. Should you get should you address the budget by raising taxes, only raising taxes, or by only cutting spending? And then what our kind of hypothesis was that if they were very extreme on one end, so they thought they would be able to increase taxes or cut spending by 100%, but not increase taxes, then they would do the budget tool, see that it's be educated more about the actual budget. Then submit their budget. Then they go in to do a post-survey questionnaire, and then this questionnaire would ask them the same question on how they would address the budget. And we thought we were hoping maybe that the kind of the balancing tool, and by seeing how budgets actually work, that would moderate kind of their preferences for tax or spending. In the end, we didn't really get that, but we did end up with some really quite interesting results in the end. So, and then the other thing is, so we worked with a survey company called SSI, and I'm not 100% surveys. I just read it today. I was just looking over it. Anyway, if you look it up on, you can find it. There's SSI, there's YouGov, there's Qualtrics. There's about 3 or 4 really main survey companies that do kind of international surveys, kind of all over the world. But the SSI is one of the major ones. And what they did for us was basically, so we built the survey in Qualtrics, and we provided a link at the bottom of the pre-survey. So they finished their survey. We provided a link and an ID number, so that once they've done that to be taken over to the budget tool, they could do their budget tool, submit the budget tool, then they'd have to put their ID back in, and then they'd be linked up back to a post-survey questionnaire. And through that ID number, we could keep track of all their data in an Excel spreadsheet. It was actually SSI was quite good. There are if you have the money to spend, there are better companies out there, but SSI was quite good, and they were flexible with what we needed them to do for us, because YouGov, for example, wasn't able to link the balancing act to the Qualtrics survey. They were worried that things would get messed up and we wouldn't end up with the data, and then there'd be problems in the end. But so that's kind of how we approached it from a research standpoint. I've got a couple of graphs if you want to see some of the data.
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
So this is kind of this pre-survey and post-survey question that we asked. I think this is actually because they're so similar. People didn't really, after taking the Balancing Act, they didn't really adjust their views on how they should address the budgets. But so I basically broke this up into spending to taxes overall, so across the whole sample, spending to taxes by who they voted for in the 2016 election, spending to taxes by gender, and then spending to taxes by baby boomers. So my colleague and my boss, actually, my ex-boss, was very interested in how baby boomers, whether they behaved differently or whether their preferences were significantly different than non-baby boomers. So I have that in the graphs as well, and you can see that most people, would cut or would cut spending opposed to increasing taxes. That's kind of the what we expected. Nobody really wants to increase their taxes. But it seems that Hillary Clinton voters are much more moderate than the Donald Trump voters. which was expected as well. And women seem to be more moderate than, and when I say moderate, it means that they prefer more of a balance to spending taxes. And that seems that baby boomers are quite similar to everybody else with respect to that balance. Let's see. Yeah, and here's some stuff about the debt overall. So most people think that it's a bad thing, and it's an important issue to address. So it's really good to get them looking at, okay, so if you think anything, what are you willing to cut, and what are you willing to increase on it? The tool is really nice to get people to make these trade-offs, and I think it does a really good job at doing that. I mean, it has some, for research purposes, you know, there's a lot in that, so everything affects everything else. So you have also, another thing is, if you are going to do it for research purposes, you kind of want to randomize the choices as much as possible. So if you're going, so people aren't kind of, if defense spending is first, and they're not anchoring, kind of making their decisions based on the fact that just because defense spending is first, and they cut defense spending. So you kind of have to randomize their choices quite a bit. So yeah, so that's about it. I think if you want, I can go into some more of the kind of interesting findings that we found, or I can open it up to questions.
But, you know, John, I have a question. It's less about the specific study you did, but more about the methodology and its applicability.
Sure.
There's a lot of researchers over the last 15, 20 years have talked about local governments doing budget engagement and hopefully finding some effective way for residents to express their preferences. But as you have noted, surveys are just a pretty limited way to understand what people value relative to other items, and also in terms of the cost associated with it. And so your studies actually inspired a number of local governments we've talked to, and maybe at least one state, to think about, rather than doing a survey to see if, for example, in Colorado, voters might be interested in increasing their taxes to fund transportation and education, rather than doing that using a survey, but instead creating a version of the simulation to do that. So that's one use case scenario I'd love your comments on. Another one is a local government that has a number of infrastructure projects that they would like to purchase or to fund. And given current revenue, it would take them about 30 years to do that. And so what they're thinking about doing is asking residents, would you like to accelerate the pace upon which we can do these projects to 10 years? And would you be willing to trade a quarter point or a half point increase in the sales tax? Do you think that the basic methodology that you've worked out would be applicable in those types of scenarios? And do you think that they actually would be better than opinion surveys?
So what I can tell you is that what we found, and this is quite nice. So what we found is that our budget tool pretty much matches public opinion surveys. So the ANES, the American National Election Survey, is kind of it's for quality, it's the best survey out there, and they ask quite a lot of questions about spending on certain items. So welfare spending, healthcare spending. Would you increase spending on this, or would you increase spending on that? And what we found, and this is kind of what we were writing, part of our article is on this, is that we get very similar results. So very, I mean, almost which gives us quite a bit of, which I think is really good actually for the budget tool, because it gives the budget tool quite a lot of validity. You may get a lot of survey people who say, oh wow, there's a lot going on here, and since it's kind of a new tool, they may not trust the results of it. But using the ANES and demonstrating budget match what the ANES is saying gives accountability. So I think it's a great idea, and I think like I that it gives people these real world trade-offs, and they actually get it. I've used it now, and I was telling you I'll use it on Monday in my class, but I've used it as kind of an educational tool in other classes already, in other demonstrations. And people will come up to me after class and say, oh, I didn't realize that this, we always think of it as kind of a single issue, but we don't necessarily think about how one side affects the other side. So yeah, I think it is. I think it's a great way to do that.
Oh, good. Well, I think we're definitely looking at exploring that with some of our other clients. So when we get to that point, we might connect you just to get some wisdom and advice from you on how to make it valid and useful. So thank you so much for that.
Sure. And I think that it's.
Please, John, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think that it's a much more interactive way of civic engagement, and I think that makes people. I don't know, but I imagine this more kind of active civic engagement is better than kind of. It does a better job of getting people involved in governance than kind of sitting around and taking a survey.
Right. Right. Okay. Great. Any questions for John?
Can I?
All right. Well, John, thank you. Oh, I think I did hear a question. Is there somebody who wanted to say something?
Oh, there. No, I think that was me. I think I was just talking to myself.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, John, and also Ryan. I'm going to go back to make myself the presenter again, and just go through a few last things with folks, and we'll finish on time. But since this is the last class with for the state NGOs, I just want to kind of put a capstone on that. Let's see. The next thing I wanted to show you was meeting mode, which Ryan has used in Alabama, and Ryan, jump in if you have any comments on that. But essentially, I'll give you a quick demo of this in just a moment. One thing that we care about, we come from a different perspective as from John, not from so much of a scholarly or research perspective, but in terms of wanting to create meaningful civic engagement, is that we love the accessibility and the replicability of an online simulation, and that it can reach thousands of people with relatively low cost. But it also doesn't allow for too much two-way communication, and so and we really like face-to-face communication as well as online communication, and so we created a way to transform Balancing Act online simulation into what we call meeting mode, which is a facilitation tool, and I'll show you that in just a moment. But I'm going to show you a few things before I do that. I just got these great pictures from the city of Kansas City that do these annual budget workshops, and these are all pictures that were taken at their budget workshop, and they're using meeting mode. It's just really fun to see all these people, very engaged. Adam Blom is the analyst there, who shared this experience with me, and I asked him, what was his overall observation about it, and he said, well, when we showed people the simulation and we gave them the instructions and cut them loose to use meeting mode, he said it was dead silent in the room for at least 10 minutes. He said people were so engaged in it, and that was just what they wanted, which I thought was kind of a cool thing. So as you can see, people are using it on the phone, but they can use it on tablets and laptops or whatever. You can use it along with Fritos. We've got old people and younger people using it. picture of the room. And then this last one, this is one, for those of you interested in state level work, this is actually not in Kansas City, it's at Denver University. And this is a big summit that was put forth by Great Ed Colorado, which is an organization that sponsors the Colorado version along with the School Board Association. And they are doing it to educate people about Colorado's spending on education and trying to raise people's awareness on that and build some momentum to possibly consider a change. So before I do that, I'm going to go to my screen here, and I'm going to show you what meeting mode looks like. So this is the Colorado version with one exception. It says facilitator view here. And so if you were to open this, instead of having ways to interact, instead of having questions down here, instead you have a reporting of results. And so this is for schools. I think I've only done this for a couple of different items. This one is for colleges. And then this one doesn't have any results in it, but it's for financial aid. So the interface for the participant, what you do is you give the participant a unique URL, and then in this case I've filtered it so that we're only looking at 4 items. If when you open it up, you've got the familiar question like the ones that Ryan was showing, but you've also got this submit category. And what the submit category does is that it's just like the normal online version, but when you hit submit category, it sends it over to the facilitator view, and every 10 seconds it refreshes. And so when you're in a big room full of people, you can see what everyone in the room has been saying and have a conversation about it. And so, for example, on school funding, I'll just sort of pick a hypothetical. It could be that you have a number of people that want to increase funding on the schools, but you've got a good chunk that don't want to, and then you can have a conversation. You say, well, why is it that you don't want to spend more money on the schools? And it could be that they don't think the schools deserve more money. It could be a variety of reasons. It could be that they don't necessarily see a linkage between education quality and spending, and then you have an opportunity to have a conversation about that. And so that's that moving away from the research side, but moving towards that civic engagement side. That's the type of conversation we're trying to help create, but to have it be grounded in an accurate description of what the services are, and to the degree possible, as much knowledge about what each of those options would do, and then to obviously also assign a cost to it so that you can evaluate not just the desirability of the options, but also look at how much it would cost, in a similar way to what Ryan was doing in his example with Gulf Shores. So that's meeting mode, and if anybody has any questions on that, I'm glad to take them. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep on going and then see if anybody has any other comments. This next slide has to do with timing for budget engagement. There's a couple of scholars, and John, I don't know if you know them or not, but they do a lot of local government finance work, and they do quite a bit with budget engagement. Carol Ebden and Amy Franklin. And they're big advocates of getting residents involved early in the process, not just as sort of window dressing or just in a sense of here's the budget and this is what we're proposing and this is what we're doing, but getting people involved very early on in terms of budget engagement. They're also pretty big advocates of simulations, but when they did this study, it was 2006, and honestly, the few budget simulations that were out there were done with paper and pencil, and so there's now a research group in the U.S. that's beginning to look at what's possible now that there's relatively easy to create relatively inexpensive online simulations available, and that's going to be a very exciting thing, I think, over the next couple of years. This is something that I created for local governments to think about engagement in the budget. And I think it's mostly relevant, I think, for non-governmental organizations. But it takes the scale that was created by IAP2, the International Association of Public Participation, and they've got 5 possible goals of why public engagement might be undertaken, and those are across the top: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. And so in my work recently with local governments, it seems like small and medium-sized governments are really interested in informing and consulting. They're really not that interested in much of a two-way conversation with residents about what the budget priority should be. And so if you're using the simulation in that context, it's a great thing just to sort of have out there in almost like a passive way so that people can sort of have an interactive model to work with. If you want to consult them, just sort of get some not too in depth or even face-to-face feedback. It could be released along with the city or county executive's budget, just to kind of get some plussing and minusing. And then these items on the left, or excuse me, on the right, involving and collaborating and empowering. Those are more along the lines of using those scenario questions, using them earlier in the process so that they can actually inform what the policymakers might decide, and they're just a little bit more in depth. And then in states like California and Colorado and Michigan and even Missouri and some others, if to the degree that if you're going to make a revenue change that you need to have voter approval, then you actually are all the way over on this far right side of empowering, because in those states that I just mentioned, the citizens, residents actually are the decision makers, at least at that very ultimate level of saying yes or no at the ballot box. So this is just something that I created, like I said, it's probably more relevant to local government, but something that might be useful for you all as you think about what your strategy might be to in using a simulation. Publicizing, once again, this is something I created for local government, but I think there might be a few things here to think about for you all. A launch page, and Ryan, chime right in if you want. We've had really good results getting earned media. Social media has been pretty good, especially if you can get an elected official to tweet or put on Facebook your simulation. Got some videos, and I'll show you a couple examples of that in just a moment, and then some town halls. Let me quickly go to the North Carolina webpage. Let me see if I can find that quickly. North Carolina. There we are. This is and Rose Nancy Richmond or Nancy Rose, excuse me, was the one who created this. She was going to be on today's call, but then something came up at the last minute. But this is the blog entry that they've used, and I think they did a really nice job just sort of describing it. And I think they might have even created a short video on how to launch it. But part of it, yeah, there's a short video. These simulations they're terrific, but it's hard to cut through the chatter sometimes and get people's attention. And so, thinking of some creative ways that you can do that, to the degree that you can, find some ways to bust through, I think that's a good thing. And we try to share best practices. So if you're getting to the point where you have a simulation and you want some ideas about how to get a little bit more interest in it, we're glad to chat about that. One of the things that we're most excited about with our federal one, and we're now seeing it at the state level, including in Colorado with the Great Ed Colorado and the School Board Association, is using Balancing Act in the schools. And so this is actually from PBS's NewsHour on our federal Balancing Act, and it's a great resource. And we're now finding, I don't know, about 10,000 students a month are using our federal one in classrooms, and it's really fun and exciting and gratifying to us. What they did is, on the far right here, they actually created they paired it with the relevant educational standards. And now there's a group of teachers here in Colorado that are doing the same thing for the Colorado version. They're pairing it to Colorado education standards, and it's not, at least in Colorado, it's not a stretch to sort of connect this to civics education or economics education. So that's one thing that those of you who are working at the state level might want to do, and I'm thinking especially of you, Ryan. Let's see. Once again, this is probably more relevant to local government, but we've got local governments that grab iPads and they take it out to parks and malls and Rotary associations and all sorts of places to meet people that wouldn't otherwise participate online and get their opinion. And that's really it. I'm just going to stop there, and see if anybody else has any comments or questions. But John, Ryan, any last thoughts from you two?
Well, I just want to say thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad people are getting interested in this. It's exciting stuff, both on both for civic engagement and for research purposes.
Yeah, well, and John, thank you to you and Sven and Kim Lee for sort of pioneering how it could be used in research purposes. We're excited about that.
Sure, and if anybody has, if you, I was just going to say, so feel free to. I was just going to say, feel free to pass my email around if anybody wants to contact me and has any questions about using it for research purposes.
You bet, absolutely, I will. And as we get these local governments, I mean, there's some significant local governments that have like 1 million people, like San Jose, California, that have asked questions about this, John. So when we get to that point, we'll be in touch. And Ryan, what were you going to say? Sorry to interrupt.
I was just going to say I've done the meeting model with 2 different groups of students, one a high school class, and then one with about 60, like a high school leadership program from across the city, across the Birmingham area. Mm-hmm. And both those went very, very well, and they seemed very engaged. And of course, I structured it in a way that I thought they would be interested in, and put topics in, budget topics that would catch their attention. And it was a good tool for budget. It was a fantastic tool for the lawmaking process and trade-offs and representing voters and that kind of thing. So it prompted a lot of good conversation.
Oh, that's great. I love hearing that. So, all right. Well, thanks for everyone for attending, and thanks in particular to Ryan and John for sharing what they have been doing. And I think everybody has everybody's contact info, at least John, Ryan's, and myself. If you want to be in touch, please do. And I look forward to staying in touch with everybody. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.